Great. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to another kind of Tech Thursdays talk. That we've been putting on. Eager runs multiple sessions on these on various topics. We have our teams for Tuesdays, which are of course on Tuesdays, and we run those bi-weekly. And then we have various tech topics that we talk about here on Thursdays. Today we are going to focus on Microsoft Cloud, and specifically, focusing around the Azure bits, but there'll be a little bit of call outs there for Microsoft 365, and it's really talking about planning and executing and getting that move into the cloud. Like, where do you start? How do you get going? What are the things to think about? And in a framework that you can use to follow that. So when you leave here, you should have a good understanding of how to do that, some of the things that we use and how we implement these when we're working with customers, and you could even start to do some of these on your own if you like. Now, this is more of a presentation lecture format, so it's not like a normal Teams meeting. You can't jump in and do like the live questions, but there is a Q&A box. So as we go, if you have questions, please drop them there. Now, I'm the only one here, like the technical rep today, so I will wait to answer those questions at the end, but if there's any in there, we'll look in there, and we'll also post them. If you would like us to reach back out to you in those questions, please just drop your email in there so we know who to send those out to, and we'll keep those private. We won't publish those, of course, since they have your email on there. So real quick, who is eGroup? Is this your first time joining us, or you've been invited, or you want to know a little bit of background here? We've been around since 1999. We are headquartered down in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, but we have a national footprint. We handle customers and different organizations that we work with across the United States. We are really customer satisfaction driven. That's a big thing. So you'll see here like our 98% CSAT score with all of our projects. And actually, I believe that project count is closer to 300 now towards the end of the year. So we take that pretty seriously, and it's one of our key metrics that we drive on. Recent recognition, really the big one to call out here, we are a Microsoft Gold Partner. So that really encompasses us being certified as a Gold Partner across the two major Microsoft clouds. So that's Microsoft Azure and Microsoft 365, including the Productivity Suite, which is Office 365, and their security solutions, the Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite there. So in addition to Microsoft, however, it's important to note that while we're here covering Microsoft today, we actually do operate in traditional data center deployments. And then more commonly today, that's the hybrid, where we take those traditional deployments and we're marrying them up with Microsoft Azure and Microsoft 365. These are some of the key partners we work with. So we are not just taking people to the cloud, modernizing in the cloud, we're actually helping them modernize their traditional data centers as well, and making that decision, right? When is the cloud better? When do I stay local? So keep that in mind, because if you have those questions, we can certainly help there. So as for me, I'm the Director of Cloud and Managed Services here at eGroup. I've been with eGroup for 8 years now. I do have a technical background, which is why I'm actually here today giving this presentation to you. And my team and I, we've worked with hundreds of different customers, and we've done kind of countless migrations, both on the Azure and the Microsoft 365 side, and again, from those hybrid data center type of scenarios and projects. Before eGroup, I was actually with the Department of Defense. I worked with the United States Navy. I was leading a team there of all the web assets for Navy medicine there. So the distributed locations there, a little tongue-tied, with tens of thousands of users that we supported. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the framework for planning and moving and going to the Microsoft Cloud. Now, one thing I'm going to call out here is Microsoft's taken and they've published a framework that they call their Cloud Adoption Framework. And we've taken some of that here and then we've aligned that to our framework, but we've also been doing this for quite a while, and a lot of what we've done actually already went into the framework. And that's not really by coincidence, because they took their own learnings, they reached out to partners like us, and they got input, and then they built this so that everybody had a reference that they could follow to kind of help plug in the gaps. So it's very, very comprehensive, and you can go Google it, Bing it, and just say Cloud Adoption Framework, and it's going to come up, and you'll see there's a lot in there. And a little bit of a soapbox on frameworks is people get caught up with it. Sometimes they pull it up, they see how comprehensive they are, and they either freeze or they go the opposite route and they're like, I have to plug everything in. And that's not really what a framework is for. So whether it's this Cloud Adoption Framework or we're talking PMP or some of the NIST and security side, you really need to take what works for you or what you think you're going to need for the organization, adapt and apply that, right? It's kind of like modularized homes. Take the parts that you need, you're going to put them in place and then build on that, and then leave the ones off that aren't going to work for you. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's why they're there. So looking today, if you look at what I have on the screen here, we're going to talk kind of about this process that we go through. It's deciding why I'm going to move to the cloud. How do I plan and execute across those reasons to hit my why, and then operations running it. And it is an iterative process. So in some cases, you can't go around this entire loop without hitting some of the other items. You're going to make some assumptions early on, but then you're going to have to validate those assumptions later and then adjust those reasons up at the front side, right, as you go through here. And then even after you're deployed, you're going to make some decisions on what's next or how do we optimize from that. And so it's just a continuous process here. So let's drop into the whys. Now, a lot of times the whys are there when somebody comes out to us, right? That's usually the trigger. They figured out they want to go and now they need help. They've reached out to us because we've done it and we start breaking down into this. This list that I have, I know it's a bit of a wall of text. I actually did take this from the cloud adoption framework that Microsoft had, this list. I thought it was a good list to start from. But it certainly hits on certain motivations that get people to move. So if you go down this list, I'm sure some of these will be familiar to you and they'll stick out. Probably the number one reason that we start getting into is people start talking about cost savings. It's a very complicated motivation to get into when you're moving to the cloud because it's not usually straightforward. You usually can't just take your entire data center and move it into Azure and say, hey, I'm going to save money. It's usually the opposite, in fact. So if you're going to save money, there's more planning into kind of shedding workloads that you don't know, determining what's going to run hot, moving services out to SaaS and those type of things, which we'll talk a little bit more in here. But once you have that driving motivation in that why, you can start building around that, right? Because then you go in and you just get your goals and your KPIs. What do you want to happen when we move? And a lot of that's around that motivation, right? So the example I had here, if we're moving from a colo, we want to free up funds. We don't want to renew our colo agreement, and then we want to take those funds and then apply them to another project. So we really want to build things around that. Is we're going to have to set up when is our inventories done? How are we going to move? When are we going to hit these dates? And make sure we hit it before that colo renewal so that we can actually utilize those funds on another project. Now, of course, you're usually going to have more than one goal when you break it down from this because this goal has a follow-on goal of that cost optimization, right? We want to save money. So if I move all of my assets and I'm not saving any money when that renewal happens, there are no funds to apply to the modernization project. So that would be another goal, and we would break that down on how we would make that happen and so forth. The number of goals and how you measure them are going to be very dependent on the type of project that you're running and what you're trying to get out of it. And then you can take this why and these goals that we've broken down, and you can use that to run into your business cases from that standpoint, right? When you build the business case, it's usually always about money. It's the number two things, the top two things. It's you either want to increase revenue or you're going to decrease your costs. So you can build off of that here from your motivations and outcomes. And like I said, at this point it gets difficult if you're just doing this on the fly. We're like, okay, we have these. Our motivations here are outcomes. We want to save money. How are we going to save money? And then we're going to place that in our business case initially. But we've got a lot of assumptions that we're making on how we're going to do that, which you're going to have to come back and validate once we get through the planning process, at least the initial one, right, where we get through estimations and we understand what's moving where, and then we can apply some real numbers to that. And so that's how I was saying, it's iterative, and you got to move back and forth as you're applying these. Now, again, kind of back to my framework reference, depending on your organization, you might not need to go through all these. Like building a business case may not even be relevant to you. If you have a small enough team, if you're not competing for those resources, and these resources are strictly for this, you may not have to build that business case because you might already have that from your motivation and your outcome. That might be enough, right? So definitely don't get caught in the weeds. Just apply what you need to move forward so that it makes sense and we understand why we're actually doing the project. Normally when you come and work the e-group, this is where we are really building off those statements of work that we're giving back to you on how we're going to execute a project. That's defining these steps. If you already have them, we might take them and help tweak it with you, or we're going to have discussions to break that down and really try to get there, because that's going to be the driving force between what we say we're going to help you deliver, and it's going to be around those outcomes that we want to achieve. All right. So the next step in there is you really get into planning, right? As everyone would expect, we know what we want to do, but now we got to figure out how we're going to get there. So there's a few things in here that you can really get into the nitty gritty depending on what we're doing. But high level, we just start with an inventory. You have to know what you're going to move, and then you're going to create a plan around how that's going to move. And then you have to understand, what do I need to make that move? What do I need to run this in operations? If it's user touching, what do my users need to know? And that's where the skill readiness comes in. And you put all this together in the planning phase, and again, we're going to run off some assumptions, early on, and those are going to be validated as you go through, your testing, your validation, your pilots, and your productions, and those will be refined through that. Kind of another view on this, if we look at it, when we go in, we take an inventory, we've got all of these things that we're going to move, these services and services. We need to then figure out like dependencies, what counts on something else as far as running, and that could be something as simple as web server requires this database server. But there's also other things in there. You might have network appliances, security appliances, third-party services that are relaying to things, and so forth. And then we want to take that and really map out what we want to do with that. Are we going to just take that virtual machine and run it as a virtual machine in Azure, right? That's the IaaS, infrastructure as a service. Or is it like a SQL server, and we want to take those databases and we want to run those on a SQL service. So Microsoft runs, SQL, and I don't want to manage the server. I just want to have access to the database, and I want to take advantage of that and the scalabilities in there. That would be platform as a service, right? That we would map that to, and then the last one, software as a service. How many of those workloads can we move, into an entirely managed type of operational model? So in the Microsoft sphere here, we're talking about the Microsoft 365 items. If I'm running an Exchange server, I would then map that out to like Exchange Online. Can I move that? How can I move, file servers and put that on OneDrive or SharePoint, right? By doing that, it means we don't have to move those like virtual machines and so forth and put those up there. And then once you've got that mapping done, you need to kind of build out, what's the architecture look like? What are the plans that we're going to do? How are we going to move with that, with our processes? What about the tools we need? Because there could be additional tools required. And then, start gaming out our communications that we need. And, communications can be tricky because it's always dependent on the organization and how they prefer communications. It could all be over email and maybe using some frontline supervisors to communicate some items, and then providing some resources for them. Or you might need to have like a lot of lunch and learns or a lot of touch points and trainings and live trainings and so forth. Very organizational dependent, but you would map that out in here and plan that out. What this is that we're seeing on screen now is called a landing zone, as you can see it labeled. This is something that Microsoft actually developed, that label landing zone terminology. That's part of their cloud adoption framework. And we agree with it. It's basically all the things on the Azure side that you're going to think about when you put something into Azure. So it's not just dropping a virtual machine out there and saying we're done, right? So before we even put anything out there, we want to look at what we need to deploy to support what we're putting there. A lot of times we start right in the middle, and most orgs will look at it, and that's what they'll start do. The things that go in the middle are like your traditional architecture. So you're going to have your virtual networks that are in there. Where are my virtual machines going to go? If I'm using services, those will be listed out in here and how they work with the networks. And that's a really big piece of that, of course. But then we have all the surrounding areas that we got to think about, right? IAM, identity and access management, and this comes into play because then we have Azure, and we have a management plane for Azure, and we may have services that integrate with our IAM that's in the cloud, or we may have separate requirements there. So if you're running a local, domain controller Active Directory that's driving some of your internal applications, you still need to manage and govern that. But now we also are adding kind of the management plane with Azure and the Microsoft Cloud services in there. And that can be just to access the management plane, but it also might be driving services. For instance, your accounts that go into the SQL service will be in there. If you're running some of the VDI, right, the Windows Virtual Desktop application stuff, it integrates with that directory. So those are all things we have to think about. We also have to consider, the other items in operations here that you see around Cost Manager, Azure Monitor, Network Watcher, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So around the skills area and the adoptions there, I'm just going to point out Microsoft Learn has become a really great resource. It's a free resource that you can leverage. And, it's good for end users. It's good for IT admins. They have a lot of documented information there that kind of summarizes what you would see in the formalized docs, and it has links out there, so you can basically start with the learn, and if you need to go deeper into a technology, you can go out to the documentation and get that. It also is a mix with some videos and some walkthroughs and some labs, depending on what the learning paths are that you're going through. But it's a tremendous resource that everyone should take advantage of. Even if you're out there and you're really experienced around with some of these things, going through there, even quickly can sometimes fill in gaps and things that you didn't know, which sometimes happens when you've been around for a while and you go back and kind of relearn the basics and you're like, oh man, I forgot about that, or I wasn't sure about that. And so great resource there. Another resource that you can look at is Channel 9. So if you Google or Bing Channel 9, Microsoft Channel 9, there's a lot of video references they do there, and they host all of their previous conference videos as well. So the Ignite conferences that have happened, I mean, this recent one was all virtual anyway, but even previous ones, they take those videos that are recorded, they're all posted there, so you can go back and see that. Those are presentations not only by the Microsoft folks, but you'll have other partners and those dealing with the technology and how they use it for different use cases. So it's another great resource. They also run on Channel 9, there's also like an Azure Friday. They just do quick, it's 15-minute videos on new things coming out of Azure, how to apply things. So another great resource. And then of course, when we're working through these exercises, eGroup augments all of this with kind of that real-time, just-in-time learning. So when we're going through the planning exercises, whoever we're doing that with is also getting that benefit. We're doing the explanation of why we would move one workload to this particular service and so forth. And then as that gets implemented, we're helping educate on that. That can also help speed up the learning path, because a lot of times you're like, well, where do I start? And I could start from ground zero, but I'm not sure. This is very contextualized because we know what we're doing. We know what you're moving, you know what the workloads are, and it's very targeted from that standpoint. So you're jumping in and you're kind of getting to know what you need to know to work in Azure. And then you can supplement it with some of those other resources that I actually talked about earlier. Okay, so planning's done. You've gone in there. We're working towards the adoption execution phase. If you go to the Microsoft Cloud Adoption framework, you're going to see adoption in there, which is part of its name. That's essentially what Microsoft is just deeming the phase when you start putting things in their services, right? When you're actually utilizing them. So here we're going to build out the architecture, that landing zone that you saw before. We're going to deploy resources, our virtual networks. You're going to set policies in place. You're going to set your initial monitoring in there. So any security that has to be turned on at that point, that's going to be turned on right here. This is where our testing, validation, pilot, and then eventually the production rollout is all going to happen. It's all going to happen in this phase. This is the big execution phase. And in here, again, we do bounce back and forth. We try to do most of what we can up in planning, but that planning is just based off a lot of assumptions that we are making on how things are going to move when we run the workloads, right? We've captured all the dependencies. We might move something and find out, oh, we didn't know about a dependency, or you didn't know about a dependency, where we have to go back and adjust that. So you'll bounce back a little bit in there, and that's where the testing, validation, and the pilot periods come in. And then when you're ready for production, of course, that's all tested and validated, and hopefully goes off without any issues. So in there, though, we talked about kind of your planning, your cost management, and what you have to account for, and some of that's tools. So in this case with tools, it depends on where we're moving and where we're going. So if we've mapped things out to like a software as a service, we might be moving Exchange to Exchange Online. A lot of times when we do that, we're gonna use the native tools that Microsoft gives us. It's a great experience there for the users, but we might supplement that, say if you're running public folders. So that would be here where we plan that. You get that tool in place there. Other items for consideration: if you're running SharePoint and you want to move that up, or you have local OneDrive, on your SharePoint service, we're going to move those up, or file shares and home drives. That's where we would start talking about what tools are available, where does it make sense. Microsoft does provide tools to really move a lot of these workloads into those SaaS operations. They were what I will call just good enough tools, and they will work in smaller environments, but as the environments get, as they scale up, as we're talking the high end, thousands of users, lots of data, files that may not support it, that we have to start weeding out, then you're probably going to move outside of the Microsoft tools and start looking at other tools. Share gets a popular one. That's one we use for that. It does the analysis, it does the moving, it helps us remap things as well as permissions and so forth like that. So lots to consider there, especially when you're moving, from a traditional workspace into a software as a service type of workspace. And it's also very common that this might be the first workload that you consider moving when you're going to the Microsoft cloud. Other ones here on the right, this icon is actually represent a suite of tools. It's called Azure Migrate. So if you have access to the portal, you've got a demo trial, or you're running in production, if you go in there, there's actually a service you can search for called Azure Migrate. And it's actually a suite of tools. So it's very comprehensive. And when we're doing Azure migrations, we rely a lot on actually this tool, more so than having to lean out to third parties. It can do an analysis and an inventory for you. Again, remember, one of the first steps are to do an inventory. You want to know what you want to move. So you can run this on physical servers, and you can reach out there, get some information on that. It can, be installed alongside VMware and Hyper-V and pull all the information out on the virtual machines. When you're doing the assessment here, it's going to try and size those machines for you and say, hey, yes, we think based on the data we have, you can size the machine this way and put it into Azure. Now, this is a best guess. Sometimes they're close, sometimes they're not. I've seen it size VMs that are really much too small for production capacity. So, take that with a grain of salt, because what you're going to do here is take that, and a lot of times you might start with that. If you're working with somebody with some experience and they just know that this workload needs to go up, you'll adjust on that. And you're going to start running your workloads that way, and you're going to want to optimize as you go. You're going to run it, you're going to see and make sure what I'm doing there doesn't impact users, right? If I run a server and it's hosting an application and I scope it pretty tight, based on this Azure Migrate report, but users report it slow, then of course I'm going to want to give it more resources. So that's a nice thing about the cloud, though. Of course, I'm not buying new bricks to expand those VMs when I need that additional size, right? I just start with that size and then I move up. And that's another important concept when you're moving to the cloud too, is you want to scope things tight, because you pay for what you use, right? You don't want to reserve capacity. So, locally on your deployments, you've got, probably 50% of capacity that's not doing anything. It's there for spikes, for movements, for your VMware moves. That's not what you necessarily want to do here in the cloud, because you have to pay for all that, even when it's doing nothing. So you want your virtual machines to run pretty hot most of the time. And usually, whereas I might say 30-40% is what I'm running my VMs, on premises in my data centers, I'm probably looking for that to be somewhere between 60 and 80 on my CPU utilization, right? Because those compute costs are really the heaviest part of that. Storage, a little bit different with the way the storage is, because the storage, when you're using solid state storage, that you're buying for capacity. So that's a little bit different, right? You want to size it as close to what you're going to use, room for growth and so forth, but pay for that. But it's also not usually as expensive as the compute costs that you're running there. So beyond the virtual machines, which, hitting on that, beyond the native host clusters, is it supports a variety of actual operating systems that you're going to move. So of course, the Windows operating systems that are all currently supported now are exported in Azure Migrate. And I will add a note that Windows 2008 and 2008 R2, even though those were end of life, if you're running those in your data center, they're not currently supported getting security patches and so forth. Azure Migrate supports moving those. And once they're in Azure, there's actually an extended lifetime as far as those patches and security updates for those operating systems. So that can be a good motivation and a why to move, right? You're a little bit at risk running those now currently, but if you move those to the cloud, they're fully supported by Microsoft. So Linux machines, there are a set of Linux machines that are also supported for moving those. Other considerations that Azure Migrate doesn't do on that side will be like your virtual appliances potentially, or if you've got hardware devices on the edge, so your firewalls and load balancers and those type of things, those we would go through an exercise to see what works best. I mean, is there a virtual appliance that you can take that physical appliance and put it out there? Or your virtual appliance, does that run in Azure? So there's some homework that generally has to be done to make sure that that's going to work for you. So the other step you have here is there's a tool in there for assessing your databases. So when you run that, we can point that at SQL servers, and it's going to analyze those SQL servers. And it's not going to just do the capacity analysis on that and what you run. It's going to make recommendations on, should that be a virtual machine? Should that run on a SQL instance? Or should that run, within a hosted database. So a little bit of the difference is there, right? If you're running a VM, you're putting SQL on it just like you would normally. A SQL managed instance is essentially where you get access to the instance itself. So think about, you're in SQL Management Studio, you get in, see it, you get to see all that same stuff and manage multiple databases from there. And then you can just go directly to a SQL database. So Microsoft kind of manages the instance and all those properties there. You're just connecting to the database and running off that. They have what's called a serverless option on that too, where you can save money if databases are only accessed infrequently. It essentially lets you run it and then it turns off. So pretty neat stuff there. Detailed reports. It also covers not just Microsoft SQL, but I believe it does an analysis there for MySQL, and I think Postgres is in there now. Now, if you're running like Oracle and DB2, that's not on here because they don't have a hosted service that runs those. So those are more than likely going to just be ran and analyzed under your virtual machines assessment, and you're going to run those as those workloads on Microsoft Azure. So applications and like web applications, that's another thing that Azure Migrate does here. If you're running, the Microsoft stack, so the .NET and IIS, and you've got it deployed on a server, and you might be considering taking that off the server and going to their app services, for instance, where again, they manage the server, you're just looking at the web server part of it, or IIS. It will do an analysis on that and tell you what can move if it's going to have any issues, and help you manage that process there. So that's another good tool to run when you're trying to map that. Should it be a VM? Should it be a PaaS kind of thing? And what's the last one? The one they just actually added was VDI. So it will look at like remote desktop services that you're running and give you some recommendations on moving that over to VDI that's all VDI, right? The Windows virtual desktop. So Windows virtual desktop in the cloud is it's pretty interesting. If you run a VDI solution, whether it's Citrix, VMware, or RDS, you've got to set up the management infrastructure, which usually can be a little daunting all in itself. And then you have the hosts that run the desktops. With Windows Virtual Desktop, however, Microsoft's essentially taken and owning that piece of it. So, the broker, the web interfaces, the licensing manager, those are all set off in its own space, and you really don't have to manage that or worry about it. They worry about the scaling and all of that behind the scenes for that management plane. They've also made it so you're not talking like 3389 direct remote desktop right to it. It's behind a proxy in there, and then you're just responsible for deploying the virtual machines that are the hosts for the user's desktops. So it's a pretty slick tool, and in a lot of cases you're already paying, say, the RDS CALs for running other solutions, and Windows Virtual Desktop could actually fit in there and save you some money when you're looking at that. Depending on what you need it for. There are some use cases still where Citrix, for instance, can provide a better experience than Windows Virtual Desktop today, and might still be applicable. But it's definitely something to check out. Not only does this run in Azure, like I said, if you have RDS CALs, you can actually run it. And saying that today, there's no cost on that infrastructure side. You can run the server OS like that. But if you have the Microsoft 365 subscription that has the Windows 10 SKUs in them, that gives you the rights to actually spin up a virtual machine that runs a Windows 10 multi-session host. So what that means is I essentially, in the past where I've had to deploy all these server OSs and carve those out for users, I can actually use a desktop OS here, and it's more native experience that I would get like just on my laptop running Windows 10, and it's a pretty good experience. So, okay. So we've talked a lot about that. We've got the planning. You get into the the execution side of things. You're looking at your tools. You've got to get your testing, your validation, your pilot out there, and really around the pilot time frame, you're going to consider the operations. How am I going to run on this? How are my help desk going to handle things, as well as what tools are in Azure to help me do this? And this again can swing all the way back up to some of my planning activities, right? We saw that landing zone that was in there, and some of these operations are actually in there. So we'll make some early assumptions on what we're going to put in place, map them up with maybe what your organization currently does, as well as some new items. And then as you get into the operation phases, you're going to get that feedback. You're going to find out what's happening. Is anything missing? Do I have gaps in something that I'm doing? And you're going to continuously apply that and apply these different services that are out there. So if we go back and look at our landing zone again, you're going to see I've highlighted some areas here. We talked already a little bit about the identity management, but there's also things to consider like policy. In policy in this case is actually we're referring more to Azure Policy as a technical policy, but a good call out is your normal like management business policies as well as far as like your governance. Those are important here as well. But Azure policies will actually give you some pretty powerful methods of restricting use, as well as a method for auditing certain things. So for instance, when I'm in Azure, the virtual machine sizes can be very small, and they probably I think you can get them down to like $20 a month to run a small VM, but they move up into the thousands of dollars per month when I'm driving like a big database in there with licensing, or maybe one of the larger NVIDIA powered machines that are out there, right? The big GPU scale sets that you're going to get. I mean, those, you turn one of those things on and your bill is going to skyrocket. But we can restrict that. If you never have a use for that, you can have a policy that doesn't even make that available. So regardless of who's in Azure, they're not going to be able to deploy that virtual machine side. From the security standpoint, we can do things like limit public IP addresses. So when you're in Azure, you can apply a public IP address to almost anything, right? And directly get access out to the internet. And you may want to drive that through a virtual appliance, whether it's an ASA or a checkpoint or something like that. You might want all traffic to go through there. So in order to do that, we would apply a policy that says no public IP address is allowed, and it's not going to allow anyone to deploy that and restrict that. And we might also say, hey, I need a route added, so we can have a custom route table in Azure to actually go through my appliances, so I'm not bypassing any of those managed and monitored routes. So policies themselves are very powerful in that way, and you can create these policies and then bundle them up. And by the way, a lot of those policies I did talk about are actually available, at least starter policies, out of the box with Azure. They're going to give you a set of policies that are used quite often, and you can modify those to fit your needs. Additional policies are actually out on GitHub, where Microsoft has published those as well as some in the community. So there's some different recipes that you can follow for other scenarios in there. There are literally thousands of different combinations that you can do here. And that also, like I said, goes into compliance. So the other box we talk about the managing and the monitoring. Some of that's inside of VMs, traditional things. You're like, my VM's up, it's down, my CPU, that's all happening in here. But you're going to have like a compliance dashboard. You're going to have those policies that are out there, and it's going to say all of these guys comply, all of these people don't. And you can also tie that into some automation stuff that's out there. Again, it's a little more advanced, but when we do the road mappings and then the mappings and what we're taking advantage out there, those are the things that we're actually going to cover. So over on the left, cost management, and down kind of the left and the bottom, I really group Azure Monitor, the security center. That's really Azure Security. Those are two big things. The cost management portion of the cloud is really huge. So, as we said, if we're moving to save money, then we need to really look at what we're spending here, because you won't necessarily do that right off. Running a virtual machine that's really large, like I said, can be thousands of dollars a month and can really rapidly increase that bill. So Azure gives you a cost management portal where you can come in, you can see what you're charged, generally on a daily basis. And you see right here in this image that I have up, it actually gives you a projection of where you're going to end up as well. So that's helpful, one, to manage it. We can also drill down into resources. We might have put tags to group resources or use what are called resources groups. And we can actually dive into that to actually see what the different cost points are. So I can literally go down and say, hey, this virtual machine cost me this, or I might want to see an application, right? The application has load balance virtual machines on the web. We're running virtual machines running SQL, and it's running a firewall. I can tag those so they're grouped all together and then go look at it and see what it's actually costing to run that. It's also sets as you get going up your baseline, right? Your first few months in Azure, it's going to move up and down because some data ingress, egress as data moves. You adjust performance levels on your VMs from testing, but once you get into that 90, 120 days, you should start getting a very good baseline of where you're at. And you want to kind of see that, because then when you're coming to this graph and you're watching the trends, if you see that trend go up, then something new has probably been deployed or something's been enabled. And if you're not aware, it's something you're going to want to track down, either to turn it off or to make sure you get it approved and it's operating as you expect. So also within here, we have some management tools, which you would hope for, right? If I can see it, I can see what I'm spending. I also want to put alerts in there, so I can have my alerts when I hit certain thresholds, so I get notified, so I'm not surprised on this. I can also set up budgets, and I can set up controls in that within the budgets. The budgets, maybe that's just going to alert me, or I might put separate budgets for different contexts depending on who has access to things, and limit it completely. So when you hit your budget, things get turned off, or I'm not going to allow you to run it anymore, right? You can do some of those things with the budget tools that are in here. And a side note here is what you'll see with these cost optimization tools is that a lot of them are reaching out and working with other public clouds, and this is the same, just the same. So there are actually hooks in here. If you were working like a multi-cloud type of strategy and you're running workloads in Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services, there are actually configurations here where you can reach out to those and pull all that data in here as well and report on it. So it's something they're continuously iterating on. They're continuously making better to give more controls over that, because cost governance in the cloud is a very, very big thing. Azure Security. So Azure Security it really started off a lot simpler. We talked about policies a little bit. It was really about the defense in depth. It matched up very well with the traditional security, layers we would put on premises, but they've matured that a bit. And really the one that it starts with is Azure Security Center. So while there's a free version of Azure Security Center, it's going to give you some light guidance. It's going to have what's called a secure score, which is really nice if you don't have a framework you're working off for your security and risk management. That gives you like some best practices to start with. But the real power comes when you pay into their standard package and you move that up. That's going to give you access to things like just-in-time access management on your virtual machines. It basically closes off ports for, say, remote access. That's even local. So I can be on an Azure network and have the machine right next to it. I can't talk to it on RDP. It's going to be shut down. I have to go into Azure, request access to that. It will then look where I'm requesting access from. It will create a rule for my IP address to access that machine on that port, typically like 3389 for an RDP, for instance, or I might be doing PowerShell or some other management tool like that. It covers those, and I got to put a reason in, and it's going to open it up. It's going to give me a time frame, but it's only going to be to my IP address, so I can run what I need from that. It's going to go in that. It's all logged. It's all audited. Then it's going to shut back down. So that's a pretty nice tool in there as far as when we're mitigating against lateral attacks and things like that use RDP or those PowerShell methods. Vulnerability scanning, so you're going to turn that on. So they currently integrate, I believe it's Microsoft uses Qualys scanner, right? So if you're familiar with that, if you use that for your own internal scans, that's essentially what Security Center is doing inside of Azure. Now, it's scanning your virtual machines and your networks just like you normally would on a local data center, but it also has integrations as far as scanning and giving you recommendations on some of your PaaS services. So when we're talking about app services, containers, and the SQL hosted services, it integrates with that and also gives recommendations on there. So very helpful. Defender for endpoint. So when you deploy a 2016, 2019 server, the Defender antivirus is on there. If you're running Windows or Microsoft stacks, but most of you are probably familiar with that. But that's just the local scanner. When you hook that up with the Defender for endpoint, it actually integrates that as well as the services. If you've got the M365 licenses with the normal desktop coverage for that, it can do things like monitor what's running on that server, who's accessing things, the SaaS services that are coming out. It pulls all that data back and puts it back into kind of their security platform. So all those signals are going into that platform and now can be associated with your identity, things that are happening, the vulnerability scans, access management that's happening in the cloud. These all start to come together, and from a security perspective, using more of a holistic picture. Anyone that's been working in the Microsoft Cloud knows there's a lot of security tools around there, and there's different ways of handling that. So there's different ways you might go look for that from managing that perspective, but it also gives you hooks to the automation platforms to actually do things on those alerts, by the way. So when you just have the Defender by itself, the antivirus, it really just runs locally, which it's still good to have that, but you're not going to have all those other integration features. Secure score on this list we talked about, and then once you turn on Security Center, it actually the policies we talked about gives you so many more policies to actually enable that you don't have to create around some security best practices and compliance too. So for instance, if you're running something like PCI or HIPAA, you can apply these policies that are already preset to meet some of those requirements, and then it's going to give you a report on what you need to go fix and audit on that. So very helpful. The other one, Azure Defender. So these Defender names are recently renamed. Azure Defender is actually not licensed in Azure, but it's part of an M365 subscription. So either like in the E5 M365 E5 package, or their Enterprise Mobility and Security E5 package, you're going to get access to Azure Defender. That lets you take these agents, you run them on your domain controllers, and it sends data up into the cloud as well, and you get some of that behavior analysis and feedback and reports on kind of things like impossible travel, things we get in the cloud natively. We can actually get some of those reports and analysis from our local domain controllers as well. So it allows you to integrate that. That's some of that hybrid connectivity we're talking about. And that's a good note too. That security center we talked about actually works outside of Azure. There's an agent. If you wanted to extend some of these capabilities out to things that aren't running in Azure, you can actually deploy those out and take advantage of some of those features as well. Azure Sentinel I have here. So this is Microsoft's cloud-based SIEM. And what it does, it works with Azure Monitor. So Azure Monitor itself is a big topic. They really combined what they had with two services, which was Monitor and Log Analytics. When you run things in Azure and you turn them on and you turn on logging, it's all going to this service, right? And this service is a collection point for all that data. And then you can run reports on it. It uses a language called KQL, which a lot of Microsoft products actually use that. And you can query just about anything you want on your data, and then you can do a point in time, looking for something very specific, or you can run like a metric or a runtime report on something through Azure Monitor. So for instance, if I wanted to create a report or alert on CPUs that are running over 90% for 5 minutes, I can actually build and query that and get that from Azure Monitor. Azure Sentinel builds on that. So while Monitor on itself, if you're just working in Azure, kind of works like a SIEM. Azure Sentinel expands that because it lets you get additional sources. So you might have other virtual, edge appliances that you want to pull in. Maybe in your hybrid data center, you want to pull that data in, and you want to have that all integrated and available. It can have all of that, right? So you have a syslog server that can be running, or a small collector agent. You can send stuff there, send it up there. Firewalls might a lot of times will support that directly. Just point your paths there. And then you have that data there. And it becomes really valuable if you're running a SOC. Most of them will know what this is and how to run it, and they're going to run through hunting exercises looking for things. And that's where Sentinel kind of helps as well, as it can give you some pre-populated runbooks. It also applies machine learnings and AIs based on what Microsoft's already seeing with your data to help identify threats in there. And that will run in there, and you can set up alerts and so forth to run on that. Then you can also hook that into automation as well. That goes out and does some action, whether it's alert, turning something off, or sending messages and so forth with any of the automation platforms in Azure, which there are multiple to choose from. So it's very powerful. The other thing about that is where it comes into handy. The Log Analytics, Monitor, and Sentinel is with the Microsoft 365 side of things. Tons of logging available on the Microsoft 365 sides of things, but most of those logs only hold things for 30 days, right? And some of the higher tiers do let you extend that out to 90 days, but almost all of the packages that you're probably running are 30 days. If you want to hold that longer, you have to redirect those logs, and you have to send them over to Log Analytics and Monitor in this workspace. And when you do that, of course, Azure Sentinel will also have that data, and you can run reports and queries on that data. So it's probably that mid-tier corporations that are going to use it. They might have a security professional or someone with that experience with hunting in there, and large enterprises, of course, would go. If you're smaller, it's probably going to be a little bit too much. And while most of the Office 365 data you ingest is actually not, it's going to be done at no cost. You got to pay for the storage for the log analytics. There are other things that are really vital to make that service, like the identity management, the Azure Graph, and things that you're going to pull in. That's going to have a cost of the data comes in, and you just want to make sure it makes sense for what you're getting out of that and what you're running. But altogether, that's kind of the Azure security. And as you can tell from what we're talking about, we can go pretty deep into smaller services that support all of these as well. So great, guys. That's the end of the presentation. It was a lot, and we did stay kind of high level going across there, but it really is the process that we follow. We've been successful with it, going across those different services that we deploy and helping people decide where they're going to deploy things. If you're interested, we run these workshops. We have a variety of them in here. You'll see this is just a sampling here, mostly Azure focused. With some of the workshops we do the Microsoft 365 workshops as well. both in terms of mapping what you want to move, but also what's all in there. What am I buying with it? How do I use it? How should I be thinking about it? You know, we can educate you on all of those. So definitely reach out. If you have further questions, if you need any clarification, if you're interested in these workshops, and we'll be happy to get you started there and help you out any way we can. So thanks everyone for joining. I appreciate it. I enjoy your Thursday and getting close to the weekend, so have a great weekend.